It was an ordinary morning, one of those rare moments when everything seemed calm. The sun had barely risen, and the faint smell of coffee filled the air. My daughter, a sweet and intelligent young girl with a disability, was eagerly preparing for another school day. She carefully organized her school supplies, pens, notebooks, a new backpack, her tools for learning, her means of connecting with the world. For her, these weren't just objects. They were her lifeline, the gateway to her dreams, and a sense of normalcy in a world that often seemed indifferent to her struggles. I could see the excitement in her eyes as she carefully checked each item, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming importance she placed on every single one of these supplies. To most people, school supplies might seem like an insignificant part of the back-to-school routine, easily replaced or forgotten. But for my daughter, these items were essential. They were the bridge between her and the world she wanted to engage with, the world she wanted to be a part of. As someone living with a disability, every day at school was a challenge, but she faced it with determination and a smile. These supplies weren't just markers and paper, they were the tools she used to communicate, to create, to learn. Without them, her school day would be a struggle. And yet, on this day, something unimaginable was about to happen, something that would turn our world upside down and test everything I thought I knew about justice, empathy, and humanity. The drama began to unfold when I discovered that my daughter's school supplies had gone missing. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she misplaced them, or perhaps they were tucked away in the wrong drawer. But as I looked around the house, confusion started to set in. These weren't just any supplies, they were special, picked out with care, each item chosen to support her unique needs. With a growing sense of dread, I began to realize that they weren't lost, they had been taken. Someone had stolen them. And not just anyone, no, it was someone who, despite being entrusted with a position of authority, had decided to take advantage of their power. It was Karen, a member of our homeowners association, HOA, the very person who had been acting like a watchdog of the neighborhood, and who had made it clear in the past that she held strong opinions about what was appropriate in the community. I couldn't believe it. She had stolen the supplies that meant so much to my daughter. How could someone do that? It wasn't just a theft. It wasn't as simple as taking a few items that could be easily replaced. No, Karen had taken something far more valuable. She had taken away my daughter's right to learn, to feel included, to have the same experience as other children. It wasn't just about the school supplies, it was about everything those supplies represented, an opportunity for my daughter to be a part of something bigger, to engage with the world, to show her potential despite her disability. To steal that from her was an unforgivable act, and as the realization settled in, so did the rage. Who did Karen think she was? How could she be so heartless? My mind raced as I tried to piece together the details. What had she done with the supplies? Why would she take something so precious to a child who already faced so many obstacles? But no matter how many questions I asked, there was one undeniable fact. Karen, who had so often hidden behind her position of power in the HOA, had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The idea of confronting her terrified me. I didn't know what she would say or how she would react. I knew that Karen was no stranger to confrontation, and I was afraid that she might dismiss this as a trivial matter, something unworthy of attention. But as a mother, I couldn't let that happen. I had to stand up for my daughter. I had to make Karen understand that this wasn't just about stolen supplies, it was about respect, about boundaries, and about doing what's right. As much as I dreaded the conflict, I knew there was no other choice. I had to confront her. The moment of reckoning was coming, and I could already feel the adrenaline building. My daughter's hope, her excitement, her dreams, they all hung in the balance. I had to fight for her, no matter the cost. But how would Karen respond? Would she apologize and return the supplies? Or would she continue to act with the same cold indifference she had shown so many times before? One thing was certain. The confrontation was inevitable, and whatever happened, it was going to be a turning point. In that moment, I made a vow to myself. I would not let Karen's actions go unchallenged. I would stand up for my daughter, for what was right, and for the dignity of every child who has ever been treated unfairly. This was not just about reclaiming lost supplies, it was about standing up to a bully who thought she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. And so the stage was set. What happened next would forever change everything we thought we knew about justice, authority, and the lengths we're willing to go to protect those we love. The Homeowners Association, HOA, had always been a source of tension in our neighborhood. At first, it seemed harmless, a group of well meaning individuals working together to maintain the aesthetic and order of the community. But as the months went by, it became clear that the HOA wasn't just about keeping the lawns green and the streets clean. It was about control, and over time, it became more and more oppressive. Among the members of the HOA, there was one who stood out for her relentless attitude and self appointed authority: Karen. She wasn't just a member, she was the one who would show up unannounced, leaving notes about infractions and threatening fines for the smallest of issues. Whether it was a tree branch slightly hanging over a fence or a shed not up to her particular standards, Karen was there to make sure that everyone knew the rules and that they followed them to the letter. I first encountered Karen when I moved into the neighborhood. As a single mother with a daughter who had a disability, I was already overwhelmed. Life was a daily challenge, managing everything from medical appointments to school needs, while trying to make our home as welcoming and supportive as possible for my daughter. The last thing I needed was a woman like Karen enforcing her version of neighborhood rules with a level of pettiness that left little room for empathy. But that's exactly what she did. The HOA had imposed all sorts of minor regulations, some of which felt unnecessary, and others that seemed downright ridiculous. Karen, however, took great pleasure in policing these rules. She seemed to have a personal stake in making sure everyone followed them, even when the enforcement of these rules seemed to be nothing more than an attempt to exert power over others. She wasn't the type to offer help or understanding to anyone struggling, particularly those with special needs. Karen's interactions with my family were always tense. On one occasion, I had to argue with her for hours after she left a note on my door claiming that our front porch was unsightly because I had a few extra bags of soil and gardening supplies lying around. I explained that I was in the middle of planting a garden for my daughter, whose condition made it difficult for her to enjoy many of the outdoor activities that other children could. But Karen wasn't interested in my story. She was only interested in the rules. And when I stood up to her, she simply told me that rules are rules, dismissing my struggles without a second thought. That interaction, like many others, left a bitter taste in my mouth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's role in the HOA wasn't about keeping things orderly, it was about control. Over the next few months, the tension between us only grew. Every time I turned around, Karen had something new to complain about. It wasn't just the garden, but the way my daughter would sometimes play outside. Her disability made it hard for her to always stay within the lines of what Karen considered appropriate behavior. And whenever Karen saw something she didn't like, she would intervene, whether it was scolding my daughter for playing too loudly or making snide comments about the way we kept our property. It was exhausting, and it started to feel like there was no escape. Karen's overbearing presence was always looming. As the days passed, I began to focus more on my daughter's needs, trying to shield her from the stress Karen created. My daughter, despite everything, was a joyful child. Her disability didn't define her, and she was determined to make the most of her life. School was where she felt most alive, and I did everything I could to provide her with the tools she needed to succeed. The school supplies I had bought her, special items designed to make learning more accessible, were not just items to me, they were an essential part of her education. They were the things that helped her interact with the world, express herself, and engage with her peers. The simple act of buying those supplies was a way of telling her, "You matter. You belong here." So, when I woke up that morning to find my daughter preparing for school, the last thing I expected was for the world to fall apart. It started like any other day, except something fell off. The backpack was missing. The new set of pencils, the notebooks with her name carefully written on the cover, the specialized scissors that made it easier for her to grip, everything that she had prepared for the day ahead was gone. I stood there in disbelief, checking every corner of the house, under every table and chair, as if the supplies might have somehow vanished into thin air. But they weren't there. I searched the entire house in panic, calling out my daughter's name, hoping she had just misplaced them. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew as I thought back to the past few days. I recalled a moment when Karen had been near our home, and I realized with a jolt that she had been watching us. The way she had stopped to stare at my daughter's school supplies left an uncomfortable feeling lingering in the air. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now the pieces started to fit together in a way I hadn't expected. The suspicion quickly turned to certainty when I noticed something else, a note left on the porch. It was from Karen, of course, a typical HOA-style reminder about our obligations. But this note, unlike others, seemed different. There was something mocking about it, as if she were taunting me, reminding me of her power over the smallest details of my life. My heart pounded as I read it again. She had stolen from us. She had taken my daughter's school supplies, and I knew it. The moment of realization hit me like a punch in the gut. My mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The anger bubbled up, but it was overshadowed by a deep sense of betrayal. How could Karen, a woman I had tried so hard to be patient with, stoop so low? What kind of person does that to a child? I could barely hold back the tears as I thought about how this would affect my daughter. Those supplies weren't just things. They were her future, her chance to learn and grow. And Karen had taken that from her. In a haze of disbelief and anger, I knew one thing for certain. I had to do something. I couldn't let this slide. But as I stood there, staring at the empty space where my daughter's supplies had been, I realized that confronting Karen wouldn't be easy. She wasn't the type of person to back down. She was powerful, manipulative, and used to getting her way. But I had no choice. For my daughter's sake, I had to confront Karen, and I had to do it now. It was the kind of morning I never expected to face. I woke up, as usual, before my daughter, letting her sleep in a little longer. The house was quiet, almost peaceful, and I was preparing for the busy day ahead, one filled with medical appointments, errands, and the usual rush to get everything ready for school. My daughter, despite her disability, was always excited about school. She had a love for learning that transcended any physical challenge she faced. That morning, she had carefully laid out all her supplies the night before, excited to show her new backpack to her classmates. Her routine was a comforting one, and I knew that once she woke up, she would be ready for the day. But as I walked into the room where she had left her school supplies, my heart dropped. The space where her backpack should have been her carefully arranged school supplies was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, moving quickly from corner to corner, but the backpack wasn't there. I ran through the house, checking every possible spot where she might have left it, but it was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of panic flood over me. Did she forget it at school? I thought to myself, though the rational part of my brain told me that was unlikely. No, this was different. Something was off. I found her in the living room, still half asleep, her eyes barely open. I asked her if she had seen her backpack, but she just looked at me, confused. "I thought you put there last night," she mumbled, still groggy. My mind raced. If she hadn't misplaced it, then where had it gone? It was her most important possession, the one thing that she held on to with such care. Every item inside that bag was more than just a supply. It was a tool for her education, her way of connecting to the world. I started to feel that gnawing, uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach, the one you get when something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I walked outside, trying to clear my head, only to find something that made my blood run cold. A note, sitting innocently on the front porch. It was folded neatly, and I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Karen's. Reminder: HOA rules must be followed at all times. Please ensure all items are within the guidelines, as they could be subject to removal. The note seemed innocuous enough, but something about it felt off, almost like she was sending a message. I looked back toward my front yard, the place where Karen had been lurking just a few days ago, taking notes and glancing disapprovingly at my daughter's school supplies. In that moment, it all clicked into place. She had taken them. The realization hit me like a freight train. My daughter's school supplies weren't just misplaced. They were stolen, and I knew exactly who had taken them. Karen had crossed the line from being an overly controlling HOA member to a petty, vindictive person who thought she could just take whatever she wanted without consequence. This wasn't just about rules or property. This was about something much bigger: my daughter's sense of security, her ability to feel like she belonged. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the note in my hand, the world around me spinning. How could someone be so heartless? Karen knew what those supplies meant to my daughter. She knew the struggles we faced every day, and yet she took them anyway. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm over to her house and demand an explanation. But instead, I felt a cold, bitter anger rise inside me, one that left me paralyzed in that moment. I went back inside, pacing in frustration. My daughter had no idea what was happening. She was still waiting for me to tell her that everything was okay, to reassure her that she would get to school just like every other child. But how could I explain to her that someone had taken away the very tools that allowed her to interact with the world? How could I tell her that a neighbor, someone we were supposed to trust, had stolen from her? The emotional impact of this moment was overwhelming. My hands shook as I held the note, and my chest tightened with the rawness of what had just happened. The sense of betrayal cut deep, not just because of what Karen had done, but because of what it represented. This was about more than supplies. It was about power, control, and the disregard for my daughter's rights as a child with a disability. This wasn't just a small act of theft. It was an attack on our family, on our sense of safety and security. And yet, amidst the anger and frustration, there was a sense of clarity. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront her. This couldn't go unanswered. My daughter deserved to know that I would fight for her, that I would stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. I had no idea how Karen would react or what would happen once I confronted her, but one thing was certain: I couldn't let her get away with this. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The decision wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that Karen would somehow return the supplies on her own. But another part of me knew that this was a battle that needed to be fought. If I didn't stand up for my daughter, who would? It was time to take action, to face the person who had made this personal, to reclaim what was rightfully ours. With one final look at the empty spot where my daughter's supplies had been, I made up my mind. I was going to confront Karen, and I wasn't going to let her get away with this. My daughter deserved better, and so did I. The confrontation was coming, and I was ready to fight for what was right. The air felt heavy as I prepared to confront Karen. My heart was pounding in my chest, the steady thrum of anxiety growing with each passing second. I had always prided myself on staying calm under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't a simple disagreement over property lines or a trivial dispute. It was about my daughter. It was about her dignity, her sense of safety, and the basic right to have what she needed to succeed. This was personal, and I couldn't afford to back down. I glanced at my daughter, who was sitting in the living room, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She was putting together a puzzle on the floor, humming to herself, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She had no idea what had happened to her supplies or the gravity of what was about to unfold. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew I couldn't shield her from the truth forever. As much as I wanted to protect her from this harsh reality, I knew this moment was inevitable. It was time to teach her that standing up for what is right wasn't just important, it was necessary. Sweetheart, I called gently, kneeling down beside her. I'm going to have a conversation with Karen. I need you to stay here and wait for me, okay? Her eyes met mine with innocent curiosity, but I could tell she sensed the tension in my voice. She nodded slowly, her expression changing slightly as if she could feel my unease. Will everything be okay? She asked, her voice small. I gave her a reassuring smile, though it felt like a lie. Yes, darling. I'm going to make sure it is. I kissed her forehead and stood up, taking a deep breath. I knew what I was about to do was going to be difficult, but it had to be done. Karen had crossed a line, and it was time to confront her head on. Walking out of my house, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I walked slowly, trying to steady my breath, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. As I neared Karen's house, I could see her standing outside, her arms crossed as if she was waiting for something. Her posture was rigid, and her gaze was sharp, as though she had been expecting this moment as well. As I approached, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. I couldn't afford to lose my composure. I had to be strong, focused, and clear. I wasn't just confronting her about stolen supplies. I was confronting her about the way she had treated my daughter, about the way she had disrespected our family. Karen, I said, my voice steady but firm, we need to talk. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she saw me approaching. There was no warmth in her gaze, only a cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down my spine. She didn't say anything immediately, just raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to speak. I know what you did. I continued, the words feeling heavy in the air between us. You took my daughter's school supplies. You stole them. The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, I saw her freeze just for a second. But then her expression hardened, and she straightened her shoulders as if bracing for confrontation. I don't know what you're talking about, Karen replied, her voice tight, with irritation. There was no apology in her tone, no hint of remorse, only defensiveness. I don't have time for this nonsense. You're making a big deal out of nothing. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept it contained. It's not nothing, Karen, I said, my voice rising slightly but still controlled. Those supplies weren't just items, they were essential for my daughter's education. She has a disability. She needs them to learn to feel normal. And you took them. Her lips twisted into a dismissive sneer. Oh, please, she said with a scoff. You're acting like I took something precious. They were just supplies. Big deal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just supplies? My mind reeled as I fought to maintain control. It is a big deal. Those supplies were bought with love and care. They're what helped my daughter succeed. But you just took that away without a second thought. Karen stepped closer, invading my space with an almost deliberate arrogance. You should learn to follow the rules, she spat. I'm just trying to keep this neighborhood in order. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the problem, not me. I felt my blood boil. She was completely dismissing my concerns, minimizing the harm she had caused. The injustice of it all was overwhelming, but I couldn't let her see my frustration. Not yet. I'm not the problem, Karen, I said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. You're the one who's out of line. You're the one who thinks you can take whatever you want just because you have some authority in this neighborhood. But you don't have the right to steal from me or my daughter. And you don't have the right to treat us like we don't matter. Her eyes flickered for a brief moment, maybe it was guilt or maybe just annoyance, but then she stepped back, her demeanor becoming more defensive. I don't have time for this drama. You're blowing this all out of proportion. I stepped forward, my voice now tinged with frustration. You've gone too far, Karen. This isn't just about school supplies anymore. This is about respect. You need to give my daughter's supplies back. Now. She stood there, her arms still crossed, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. Was she trying to figure out how to weasel out of this? Or was she genuinely considering the implications of what she had done? Either way, I wasn't backing down. I'm not going to argue with you, Karen finally snapped. If you want them so badly, go get them yourself. I'm done here. The word stung. I stood there for a moment, shocked by the coldness in her voice. I had expected resistance, but this level of dismissiveness, of refusal to even acknowledge the hurt she had caused, took me by surprise. She wasn't even pretending to be sorry. At that moment, I knew that the confrontation had only just begun. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology or the return of the supplies. Karen wasn't going to back down easily, and neither was I. The situation was escalating, and I realized that we might need to take this further, whether it meant involving the neighbors or even the authorities. Before I could speak, Karen turned on her heel and walked toward her front door, leaving me standing there with a seething sense of injustice. She wasn't done with me yet, and I wasn't done with her. As I stood there, the weight of what had just transpired settling over me, I knew the battle wasn't over. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. This wasn't just about a stolen backpack. It was about standing up for what was right, and I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without facing the consequences. The tension in the air lingered after my confrontation with Karen. I stood in her front yard, my heart still pounding from the heated exchange, and watched as she slammed her door behind her, leaving me standing there speechless. The nerve of her to dismiss everything I had said, to treat my daughter's needs, our dignity, like they didn't matter, it was beyond frustrating. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook. I couldn't. For my daughter's sake, for our family's sense of justice, I had to take further action. The anger that had first bubbled up inside me began to turn into something else, something more focused, more resolute. This wasn't just about one stolen backpack anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought they could get away with anything. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breath, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. The reality was that I couldn't do this alone. I needed support, not just emotionally, but in practical terms. I couldn't let Karen get away with this, and I couldn't let her think she could intimidate me into backing down. She had underestimated the lengths to which I was willing to go. I walked back home, my steps heavy but purposeful. As soon as I entered, I found my daughter sitting on the couch, still working on her puzzle, unaware of the battle that had just unfolded. I took a moment to gather myself before I knelt beside her. "Sweetheart," I began, my voice shaking slightly. I had to talk to Karen. Her eyes widened, a mix of concern and curiosity written on her face. "What happened?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to share. "She took your school supplies," I said, my voice steady now, though the hurt still lingered. "But I told her that was wrong, and I'm going to make sure she gives them back." I watched her face for any sign of fear or confusion, but instead, she smiled at me, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. It was as if she was telling me she trusted me to fix this, to protect her. That was all I needed. The strength I saw in her eyes was the same strength I had to draw from in this moment. After talking to my daughter, I realized that while Karen may have thought this was just a petty squabble, it had much deeper ramifications. The feeling of powerlessness that Karen had imposed on me and my daughter had to be addressed. She needed to be held accountable, and if she wouldn't do the right thing voluntarily, then I would have to make her face the consequences. I didn't know exactly where to start, but I knew one thing: I couldn't be the only one fighting this battle. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just my issue, it was a community issue. If Karen could get away with treating my family this way, what was stopping her from doing it to someone else? The neighbors had to be made aware of the kind of person she was, especially if she was using her position in the HOA to bully others. I wasn't alone in this neighborhood, and I was going to make sure Karen knew that. I began by reaching out to a few neighbors I trusted. They had seen the way Karen had acted in the past, and they were all too familiar with her overbearing tendencies. I explained the situation, how Karen had stolen my daughter's supplies, and asked if they had witnessed any similar behavior from her. It wasn't long before I learned that I wasn't the only one who had been targeted by Karen's sense of authority. Several of my neighbors had experienced her controlling ways in one form or another, whether it was about petty rule enforcement or unsolicited judgments about their homes. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. This was about Karen's consistent abuse of power, and it needed to stop. As I gathered support, I began planning my next steps. I was determined to make Karen face the consequences of her actions. First, I gathered all the evidence I could. photos of the note she had left me, statements from the neighbors who had witnessed her behavior, and documentation about my daughter's needs and how the supplies were essential to her education. It wasn't just a case of a missing backpack, it was a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. If Karen had truly stolen my daughter's supplies, then this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was theft, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The next morning, I decided to take the evidence to the HOA's board members. It wasn't enough to confront Karen directly. I had to make sure that others knew what she was capable of. When I arrived at the meeting, I found that several of my neighbors had already gathered there. They had seen the same things I had seen, and now they were ready to stand with me. The meeting began, and as I spoke, I could feel the weight of every word. I wasn't just advocating for my daughter's stolen school supplies, I was standing up for what was right, for every person who had ever felt intimidated or disrespected by Karen. I laid out the facts, calmly but firmly, explaining how Karen's actions had crossed the line. The board listened intently, and while there were a few members who seemed uncomfortable, I could see that most of them understood the severity of the situation. This wasn't just about one person's grievances, it was about creating a safe, respectful community for everyone, regardless of their circumstances. When I finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. The room seemed to hold its breath as the board members deliberated. Finally, one of them spoke up. "We can't allow this to continue," she said, her voice strong. "We will investigate this further and take appropriate action." The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. I had done what I set out to do. The support from my neighbors and the board was the turning point I needed. For the first time since the incident, I felt like I had control over the situation. I wasn't just a victim of Karen's actions, I was part of a community that was standing up against her. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, discussions, and tense moments. But slowly, Karen's grip on the HOA began to loosen. The board took the matter seriously, and it became clear that Karen's behavior wasn't just a personal issue, it was a community issue that needed to be addressed. Eventually, the board voted to remove her from her position. It wasn't the outcome I had initially expected, but it was the one that felt most just. Karen had to face the consequences of her actions, and it was a long time coming. As for my daughter, she got her supplies back, but the damage was more than just material. The whole ordeal had shaken her sense of security, and I could see the hesitance in her eyes when she returned to school, but I made sure to remind her every day that she was strong, that she mattered, and that no one could take away her right to an education. Slowly but surely, her confidence returned. Karen, on the other hand, had learned nothing. She never apologized for what she had done, and she continued to act with the same arrogance and disregard for others. But the damage she had done to herself within the community was irreversible. She no longer held the power she once had, and I took comfort in knowing that she wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else in the same way again. In the end, the fight wasn't just about standing up to Karen. It was about showing my daughter that she had the right to stand up for herself too. It was about teaching her that no matter how big or small the battle, we always have the strength to fight back. And with the support of those around us, we don't have to face it alone. The days that followed the confrontation with Karen were filled with a sense of exhaustion, but also an overwhelming relief. The tension that had been building for weeks slowly began to dissipate, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The board's decision to remove Karen from her position in the HOA was a turning point for not just me, but for the entire community. The members of the board had stood by what was right, and that alone brought a sense of justice I hadn't thought I'd find. As for my daughter, the return of her school supplies was a huge relief. Watching her carefully unpack her backpack, her hands lingering on the familiar items, I could see that she felt a sense of comfort and security. But there was still a shadow that lingered. The ordeal had affected her more deeply than I realized. She was more withdrawn than usual in the days following the confrontation. Her excitement about school somewhat dampened. For a child with a disability, routine and stability are essential, and the theft of her supplies had disturbed both. She was uncertain about what had happened, and at times I could see that she was still processing the emotional weight of the incident. It wasn't easy to watch her struggle with those feelings. As a mother, you want to protect your child from anything that could harm them, and this situation felt like an invasion of her innocence. But I also knew that it was important to allow her to feel her emotions, to process what had happened in her own time. I made sure to reassure her that she was safe, that she mattered, and that no one could take away her right to be treated with respect. I also encouraged her to talk about her feelings, to express whatever she was thinking, and to remind her that she was never alone. In the weeks that followed, she slowly started to regain her confidence. The act of standing up for her, of confronting the situation head on, gave us both a renewed sense of strength. My daughter began to understand that she didn't have to accept mistreatment or injustice, that her voice mattered, and that I would always be there to back her up. While I couldn't undo the hurt caused by Karen's actions, I could help my daughter rebuild the sense of safety that had been shaken. For me, the resolution of the situation also marked a moment of profound personal growth. When this all began, I was terrified. I wasn't sure how I was going to handle confronting Karen or what the fallout might be. I felt small in the face of her authority, as though my voice wouldn't matter. But as the confrontation progressed, and as I found the courage to stand up for my daughter, I realized something powerful. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's school supplies. I was fighting for her dignity, for her right to be treated with respect. I was fighting for myself, too. In the process, I had rediscovered my own strength. The emotional toll of the confrontation wasn't lost on me, but I found that I could handle it. I could stand up to people like Karen, people who sought to bully others into submission, and still keep my composure. It was an important lesson in personal strength. I didn't have to react with anger or fear. I could approach the situation with dignity, and in doing so, I had gained something invaluable: self-respect. I also learned the importance of community. When I reached out to my neighbors for support, I realized that we are stronger together than we are alone. The solidarity I found in the people around me gave me the courage to face Karen and demand what was rightfully ours. It wasn't just my fight, it was a collective effort to ensure that the community we all lived in was one of respect and fairness. Standing together with others who had experienced the same treatment, who knew the kind of person Karen was, reinforced the idea that we should never let someone get away with wrongdoing simply because they hold power. Karen's position in the HOA had made her feel untouchable, but in the end, it was the strength of the community that brought about change. Looking back, I can see how this experience has reshaped my perspective on people like Karen. At first, I saw her as someone with power, someone whose actions couldn't be challenged. But as the events unfolded, I realized that people who abuse their power are ultimately the weakest, not the strongest. Karen's refusal to accept responsibility for her actions, her complete disregard for the impact she had on my daughter, showed me how insecure she truly was. She was desperate to maintain control, but her inability to face her mistakes revealed the cracks in her facade. In a way, Karen's actions had revealed her own vulnerabilities, and in that moment, I realized that people who hurt others often do so because they themselves are broken. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me find a sense of peace. I no longer saw her as a figure of authority to be feared. Instead, I saw her as someone who had, in the end, lost everything: her power, her respect, and her integrity. This experience has also strengthened my relationship with my daughter in ways I hadn't anticipated. The struggle we went through together became a defining moment in our journey. We both learned something important: that we have the power to stand up for ourselves, that our voices matter, and that we don't have to tolerate mistreatment from anyone, no matter how authoritative they may seem. The respect we had for each other grew stronger as we navigated the emotional aftermath of the incident. My daughter saw me not just as a mother who provided for her physical needs, but as someone who would fight for her, who would stand beside her no matter what. And I saw my daughter in a new light: a brave, resilient child who, despite her struggles, had the courage to persevere and move forward. It wasn't just about the stolen supplies anymore. It was about the lessons we learned along the way, the strength to confront our fears, the wisdom to recognize our own worth, and the understanding that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to take away our dignity. As the weeks turned into months, the effects of the confrontation continued to ripple through our lives. The neighborhood felt different. People were more aware of the need to support one another, to stand up for what was right. Karen, though still in the neighborhood, no longer held the power she once did. And in that, I found a quiet sense of triumph. It wasn't the revenge I had once imagined, but it was something far more meaningful, the restoration of justice, of fairness, and of our ability to hold those in positions of power accountable. As for my daughter, she thrived. The confidence that had been shaken by Karen's actions slowly returned, and with it came a renewed sense of hope. She knew that no matter what challenges she faced, she would always have the strength to overcome them. And together, we would face whatever came next hand in hand. As the camera pans out, a shadowy figure is seen lurking at the edge of the neighborhood, Karen standing on her porch, staring intently at her house. Her expression is hard to read, but there's a glimmer of something dark in her eyes. She doesn't speak, but the tension in her posture tells the story. It's clear she hasn't given up. This isn't over. She seems to be thinking, her mind working on some new scheme or revenge. But inside, the atmosphere is different. My daughter and I are sitting together, laughing, her backpack open in front of her as she picks out her supplies. Despite everything, we're stronger than before. We've learned that no matter what life throws our way, we stand tall together. No one can take away our peace, our strength, or our bond. The door closes softly, and as the screen fades to black, one thing is clear. Whatever comes next, we'll face it just like before, united and unshaken. If you've ever faced someone trying to take away what matters most to you, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, and let's stand together in the fight for what's right. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our journey here at the HOA Stories. Stay tuned for more, and remember, when we stand up for each other, we're stronger than anything that tries to bring us down.